Hello. So I wanted to make a video on how I go about writing chords. I put out a song pretty recently that has some pretty emotional chords in it. It's a pretty important song to me. If you've not checked it out before, please go have a listen. But there's a section in the song, it was actually the first section I wrote for it, but it was one of the most important sections to set the emotional theme of it all. It has some pretty specific things I did with the harmony to make it sound the way it does and to portray the emotions I needed it to portray. I want to play that section for you now and try to explain a little bit how I made that all happen. So what's going on there? Let's just start off by explaining what key I'm in. So when most people hear the song, they think to themselves, this sounds depressing, despondent, woeful, other synonyms for sad, and come to the conclusion that it must be in a minor key, or at least one related to minor, which it's actually not. And people may be surprised by that. It's actually based around a major scale. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're saying, major, isn't that supposed to feel happy, joyful, and even pretty cheesy? Well, you'd be right in most cases, but if used correctly, the scale can actually be a very emotional scale to use. And this is actually due to a couple different things. Namely that the fifth chord is a dominant chord, meaning that it has a supremely strong resolution back to the 1 or the root chord. This is the very commonly used 5-to-1 cadence you may have heard of before. Also the fact that the scale has a leading tone under the root, which is the 7th degree of the scale and is a semitone away from the root. This is actually the note responsible for making the 5 chord pull so strongly back to the root. This happens even when you don't play the full dominant 7 version of the 5 chord, because the interval is only a semitone away from home base. Listen to what I mean. Here's a little passage that only resolves so well because of that dominant 5-to-1 resolution. So this 5-to-1 cadence is the primary reason I chose to make all my chords function in major. I will not go into why the leading tone or the dominant 5 chord are so important, but the minor key simply does not have this. And there have been some scales created like harmonic minor, mixolydian to try and crowbar in a leading tone into the minor scale, just because of its extremely powerful harmonic function. So explaining all that may touch on why I chose to function in major, but it didn't explain how to actually make major sound depressing. Well, that all has to do with the chords you choose to go to. We all know playing major chords sound happy, and playing minor chords sound sad. So we want to stick to mostly the minor chords within the C major scale, and only use the major chords if we absolutely have to. Namely the root for obvious reasons as it establishes home, and the 5 for the reasons I previously mentioned, as it will allow me to resolve back to the root in a more powerful way. So what does that actually leave us to write with? Well, we get the 1 chord to establish where home is. We get all the minor chords, so the 2 chord, the 3 chord, the 6 chord, and then we get the major 5 chord because its job is to take us home. That's it. We get the major 1, the minor 2, the minor 3, the major 5, and the minor 6. Now I'm not using the 4 because it's major and it serves us no purpose, so there's no reason to go there. I'm also not using the diminished 7. This chord serves dominant function, and we're already using our 5 chord for that, so there's no reason to go there either. So in this progression, I start out by playing C major. And then I choose to go to an E minor, which is our 3 chord. This is the most important chord for the major scale to sound sad. You can tell just by me playing around with these 2 chords, I've landed on this pretty melancholy and sad mood. So there's no other chord in the diatonic major scale that was sound as sad as the 3 chord. It's called the mediant chord. Mediant actually comes from the word medium or middle, and it's called that because it's halfway between our tonic and our dominant. So all right, we're getting somewhere. I start on this C major, the 1, and then we went ahead immediately to our mediant chord, the 3, to establish a sad feel. Once I'm there, I switch to using this 3 as a temporary home base and bouncing around the other minor chords we have in the scale. So from this 3, I go up to 6, back down to my temporary home, the 3. And then I move to the remaining minor chord we have, the 2, and then I head back up to 6. So the idea here is establish home, immediately create a sad vibe by going to the 3 right away, and continue bouncing off the other minor chords to kind of wallow in that sadness for a bit. So after I've done that for a short while, I want to start making my way to the 5 chord, as it is my free ticket home and will allow me to resolve all these sad feelings properly. However, I don't want to just go immediately there because it's not going to feel genuine or like we've earned it at all. It will not sound like we fought through thick and thin, crawling and clawing our way there, earning the reward of resolution. Because remember, the entire point of this progression is to reflect some actual feelings, and if the chords don't behave like those feelings, there's a good chance they're not going to sound like those feelings. And this is where things can kind of get tricky. While diatonic major can definitely be used for some sad stuff, it can always become sadder if we know how to properly reach outside the scale and inject some much needed conflict and tension before resolving. So this is actually the point of most progressions and harmonies. You build tension, you release tension. You build tension, you release tension. And this is what it means to resolve, and it's where most of what you perceive as emotional comes from in music. The emotion is all within the tension and the creative ways it gets resolved. So we know the 5/1 cadence is the biggest release available to us. So to make things the most interesting, we should try to build up as much tension as possible before finally resolving. And one way we can do that is with a suspended chord. Now, suspended chords create a lot of tension and suspense. That's how I actually remember them. Suspense, suspended, suspense, suspended. And they resolve beautifully to their parallel major chord. Take this C sus4, for example, resolving to C major. Or you can take a C sus2 and resolve it to C major. That note falling into place, landing on that major third, is like a tiny little door opening, a pleasant little micro resolution. And we're going to use this little resolution to help us create that feeling of accomplishment that making it to the 5 chord was all worthwhile because we're almost completely home. So let's get back to the progression. So we left off on a 6 chord, and then we're trying to make it back to the 5 chord. So let's see how this suspended chord can bring us there. So suspended chords resolve to their parallel major, like we've just discussed. So we're trying to resolve to our major 5 chord, which is a G major. So I'm going to play a G suspended chord to allow that resolution to happen. So what we get out of that is our 6 to G suspended to G major. And then making it to 5 takes us back to 1. Now, this is great and all, and it's closer to what I want my chords to actually say, but we can do better. So let's see how and where we can inject more tension into this passage to establish that desperate, struggling feeling before we make it to the 5. Now, I don't want to interrupt this new suspended to major micro resolution, as it's currently serving us pretty well. So the only place I can really try to inject more tension is after the 6th chord and before this new suspended chord. So let's take a look at this change. I play a minor 6th chord, and to make it to that new suspended chord, my root and my 5th travel down a whole step, while my 3rd remains the same note. Now here's the thought. What if instead of these notes traveling down a whole step straight to the suspended chord, they actually slowly fall there chromatically, 1/2 step at a time? This is what I mean. This will step outside of our key, but it will have enough still grounded with this C note that's in both our 6th and suspended chord to make this a very emotional and moving modulation to create that desperate crawling and clawing feeling without being too jarring to the listener's expectations. And it really helps us that this note is actually C, because that's our key center. Because now look at the behavior of this section now that we've made these changes. Every note that moves does so towards the 5 chord, as it did before, but now nothing moves further than a 1/2 step at a time. So this makes this section feel like it's really trying hard, struggling to reach its destination, the 5 chord. This will help us tell the story that we're trying to communicate. And that's the entire chord structure for this section. We go from 1 to 3 to 6 to 3 to 2 to 6 to the flat major 6, suspended 5, major 5, back to 1. Let's just hear how all that sounds. I'm going to go an octave up on this one. So that may all seem like it was pretty arbitrary, the way we came to these chords, but it was actually all carefully crafted. They're all there to reflect the emotions I need them to portray. So let me color code these chords to make it all a little bit clearer. So the first chord is 1, and it functions as home. So let me give this a positive green color. Next we have our long string of minor chords. Remember, this is where we established all that sadness, so I'm going to color all these minor chords red. We will call this our pit of despair. Next are those 2 chords we injected to act as our bridge to the 5 chord, building tension along the way. Let's color these purple and call this section the desperate climb, as that's what I wanted these chords to act like they're the desperate and final struggle out of the pit of despair. Next is the triumphant 5 chord. This powerful chord represents the summit of success, and single-handedly has the power to take us home. So a bright blue like the clear blue sky seems appropriate. So looking at everything in this way, you can see that these chords do their jobs wonderfully in describing the narrative that we need them to. Starting home, being ripped away to wallow in depression, only to then desperately crawl and claw our way back to the only chord that will help us resolve these feelings and take us home. And that's the whole thought process that went into this entire section, and into the rest of the song for that matter. It really opens up and becomes even more powerful when you start adding in upper harmony notes to it all. In part 2 of this video, we're going to cover the melody in this section. I'm going to break down the notes I choose to play and what they're doing to support the themes and the narrative. But for now, I'll leave you here by playing the full section for you with all the harmony notes on top that tell the rest of the story. I'll see you over in part 2.